he wants to know is ecosystem processes involve change. So what is an acceptable rate of change, and should conservation focus on just keeping things the same? And that's a excellent question, because the answer is no, we should not concentrate on keeping things the same. For one thing, you have to decide what is the starting point that we want to go back to. What's the point that we want to protect? I mean, Bill mentioned that, 13,000 years ago?
15,000.
Yeah, that humans had dramatic impacts on the fauna of North America. So do we want to go back 13,000 years and that's our baseline? Or should we go what commonly people think of as pre-European settlement for North America? So we should go back to there. Well, what exactly did this place look like prior to European settlement? There were many more Native Americans than we usually think, because the very early explorers, not settlers, such as DeSoto, unintentionally introduced diseases that killed off a large percentage of the Native Americans. And what that means is that their impact on the land was greatly reduced. They had a high impact on the land. They farmed, they burned, they cut timber, they did all kinds of stuff. They were living here and living well in large numbers. But by the time American explorers and European explorers came in who were recording what the continent looked like, the number of Native Americans had been greatly reduced. So we got one picture before DeSoto and another picture after DeSoto, but when Audubon came through and wrote down what things look like. So where's the baseline that we want to go back to? There's no answer to that question. So in part, first conservation question is, what do you want? What do you want things to look like? We're not going to get rid of earthworms. They're here. So how do we want the world to look like in Arkansas with earthworms? Because that's the way it's going to be. So that's an excellent question, and there's no answer.
When it comes to management of our natural areas or other areas, for the longest time, people thought that the best way to help these species was to buy an area that had the species and then just basically put a fence around it and don't do anything to protect them. Just keep it static, like you were talking about. But what we found out is that when you do that, it actually has, in many cases, the reverse effect, because what you're doing is you're keeping out the ecosystem processes that are important for those species and for creating the structure of the habitat and for resulting in the species composition of the plants that you would have there that then has an impact on the animals. So now some of the stuff we do is not so much that, it's trying to figure out what kind of ecosystem processes can you emulate. And the one that's most often used is prescribed fire. We know that was common, and we know it creates destruction and so forth. So there's no so much hugging it anymore. It's it's trying to actually have the system functioning the way it did historically. Now, like Alan said, we can't go back 15,000 years ago. We're not going to reintroduce elephants. There's some logistical problems there, traffic and all kinds of stuff. But you think about these large animals, all these huge herbivores we used to have in the country. You think about an elephant. It can push over trees. It has huge little highways it goes over all the time, and it eats a whole lot. And so we had ground sloths that could reach way up into trees, and almost like a giraffe, not that high, but kind of like that. So you had these things creating these open spaces within forests, but without, and you had a lot of animals and plants that adapted to that because you had a lot of light hitting the ground, a lot of sunlight, which influenced the grasses and forbs, and then influenced the insects, which influenced the birds, etc. Well, with those gone, we still have those animals, but what do? We can't introduce elephants, but we can do things like prescribed burning, which helps emulate it to some degree.
I think also that it kind of depends a little bit too on the species, because if you're dealing with a very narrow endemic species, let's say Magazine Mountain shagreen that occurs only on Mount Magazine here in Arkansas, when it was federally listed,
that's a snail.
Thank you.
Terrestrial snail. So I know a little bit more about some terrestrial species, not just aquatics. But magazine mountain shagreen was listed because of several three threats mainly. But the two biggest were the construction of Magazine Mountain Lodge by the state park system, and the military over at Fort Chaffee was considering doing maneuvers on Mount Magazine. And so those were the main driving forces behind listing Magazine Mountain shagreen, was to protect it, because that's the only place on the earth it occurs. Now we're at a point where all those threats have been alleviated, and we understand the life history. We just finished mapping the habitat. The species only occurs on 16 acres on Mount Magazine, on talus slopes. But we know exactly where those are now. And so we're at a point where we can delist that species. And that species is one that, we can probably go back to what it historically was, regardless of whether it was, European settlement or pre-European settlement. But when you're dealing with these wide-ranging species that occur across 14, 15 states, and there's many, many anthropogenic impacts that we're dealing with, we're never going to, recovery of those species is never going to be back to that baseline. So what we have to determine is to recover that species, what is needed to maintain that species from going extinct. And what we as scientists and as society have to accept is the fact that that species is not going to occur where it historically occurred. It's not going to be as widely distributed. It's not going to be as abundant. But can we still maintain it on the landscape at some level? And that's the truth and reality of recovery. We're never going to get back to if you keep conserving, eventually you end up with nothing. Without preservation somewhere down the road, conservation leads to extinction.